The Concordate sensor array at Threshold Station 9 had been running for 800 years, without producing a significant anomaly. The station had logged approximately 400 million sensor events in that time. Of those events, 47 had required direct review by the records archivists rather than automatic cataloging. 39 had turned out to be sensor malfunctions. 7 had been previously known civilizations approaching from unexpected vectors. 1 had been a gravitational phenomenon that a junior analyst had briefly and incorrectly classified as an artificial construct. The 142nd day of year 7312 produced the 48th significant anomaly. Threshold Station 9's duty officer, a mid-rank Concordate official named Wensoth, was completing a routine review of the previous cycle's automated cataloging when the proximity alarm registered contacts at coordinates 7.7.992, a deep space position with no hyperlane presence, no known stellar objects of interest, and no reason whatsoever for anything to be there. The contacts are displaying FTL drive signatures, the senior sensor operator said, with the specific flatness of someone reading data that contradicts everything they were trained to expect. Multiple contacts, 14 confirmed, possibly more at the edge of range. Wensoth looked at the display. Where did they come from? That's the issue, sir. They didn't come from anywhere. They were not in our sensor range 60 seconds ago. They appeared. FTL emergence. From a bearing that has no hyperlane. Wensoth filed the most urgently classified report in Threshold Station 9's 800-year operational history and called the records archivists. The archivists ran the search while the station's diplomatic team was still assembling. The search took 47 minutes, longer than any previous query in the record's 3,000-year history, because the system ran multiple fallback verification routines before it would return the result it kept returning. Archivist Vel Thren read the result 4 times. Not found. Not found in the Active Civilization Registry. Not found in the Developing Civilization Registry. Not found in the Pre-FTL Observation Archive. Not found in the Historical Extinction Records. Not found in the Predecessor Study Database. Not found. That's impossible, she said to no one in particular, The records had 3,000 years of comprehensive galactic survey data. They cataloged everything. They had cataloged the migration patterns of organisms in gas giant atmospheres on 17 worlds. They had cataloged the atmospheric composition of moons with no geological activity. They had once cataloged a naturally occurring crystal formation that a survey team had felt deserved documentation, despite having no strategic, diplomatic, or scientific value beyond being aesthetically remarkable. They did not miss civilizations capable of faster-than-light travel. The diplomatic contact attempt, transmitted on 22 standard frequencies simultaneously, produced a response in 11 seconds, the minimum possible response time, given the distance involved. They had been waiting for it. The response came back in 17 of the Concordate's active languages, all with perfect grammar, accurate technical vocabulary, and natural idiomatic constructions that required significant cultural familiarity to produce correctly. Not a translation program. Cultural familiarity. Genuine, extended familiarity. The message was courteous, brief, and introduced the human species to the Galactic Concordate in the tone of someone making a long-overdue meeting official rather than initiating first contact. The final line read, "We would appreciate the opportunity to speak with the senior leadership of this governing body at their earliest convenience. We have something important to discuss." Vel Thren read the phrase senior leadership twice. Not your leadership, not your government. Senior leadership, as if they already knew there were multiple layers, and senior was the specific one they needed. "How long have they been watching us?" Wensoth asked. No one in the room had an answer. No one in the Concordate had an answer. The records, which had always had answers, had nothing. In 3,000 years of comprehensive galactic cataloging, humanity was simply not in the records, and they had apparently been out there the entire time. The historians found the entry 18 hours after the initial contact. Survey notation 7-112 Gamma, logged 847 years ago by the Concordate survey vessel Persistent Inquiry during a routine outer margin sweep. An inhabited terrestrial planet, third from its primary star, bipedal carbon-based dominant species, estimated population 800 million. Technology assessment, industrial age civilization, no FTL signatures detected, no evidence of spaceflight capability. Projected FTL timeline, 1,800 to 2,200 years. It had been in the pre-FTL observation archive, a category the initial search hadn't prioritized, because no pre-FTL species in 3,000 years of concordate records had achieved FTL ahead of their projected timeline by more than 40%. The search algorithm had been looking in the wrong place. Velthran noted the timeline. The humans had not beaten the projection by 40%. They had beaten it by more than 800%, achieving FTL in approximately 200 years rather than 2,000. Not in the range of any known precedent. Not remotely in the range. She also noted, with the specific discomfort of someone identifying a bureaucratic failure with significant consequences, that the follow-up observation protocols had never been actioned. The survey team had filed the notation and moved on. An observation satellite placement request had entered an administrative queue 847 years ago, and apparently never cleared it. 800 years of administrative neglect. The second problem was the coordinates. Survey notation. 7112 gamma placed the human homeworld in the concordate's inner survey margin, relatively close to the hyperlane network, easily observable, exactly the kind of developing civilization the concordate monitored carefully. But the human ships had not appeared from anywhere near those coordinates. They had appeared from a bearing that placed their point of departure in the concordate's outer unmapped regions, the territories without hyperlane infrastructure, characterized in the records as sparse stellar density, no strategic interest, no civilizational presence detected. When Ambassador Yara Chen sat across from the concordate diplomatic team, Velthran asked the question directly. Your homeworld is not near where you came from. No, Ambassador Chen said pleasantly. Earth is about 400 light-years from your nearest hyperlane. We've been settled in the outer regions for about 300 years. Our territory extends through 8,000 star systems out there, in areas your network doesn't reach. 8,000, Velthran said. Give or take, we're still expanding. She said it the way someone mentions a kitchen renovation, a comfortable work in progress. The military analyst who had been running background analysis on the human ship's drive signatures for 18 straight hours transmitted his report during the session. The key finding was buried in technical language but unmistakable. The human FTL drive produced an energy signature consistent with, the analyst's phrasing was cautious, theoretical operation of predecessor-class technology. Velthran looked at that finding for a long moment. The predecessors were the great mystery of galactic history, a civilization that had predated all current species by at least 100,000 years, left ruins across the galaxy, and vanished without clear explanation. The Concordate had spent 3,000 years studying 14 predecessor sites, and found that predecessor technology operated on principles current galactic science could describe but not replicate. The humans, apparently, had managed the replication. Ambassador Chen was watching Velthran's expression with the attentiveness of someone who had read the room correctly. We found the predecessor ruins about 300 years ago, she said. Our engineers have been working with their technology since then. A pause. We've made some improvements, she added. The Concordate diplomatic team absorbed this information in the specific silence of people who will need significantly longer than this meeting to process what they have just been told. Ambassador Chen waited, with the patience of someone who had expected exactly this reaction and had allocated adequate time for it. How many sites? Velthran asked finally. Ambassador Chen glanced at Dr. Sola Reyes, the delegation's chief predecessor researcher, who had been quietly reviewing her notes in the corner of the room. I'll save that for the full presentation, Dr. Reyes said, with the specific care of a scientist who understands that certain numbers require a prepared audience. High Admiral Sothkavar had arrived with 6 capital ships and a directive to establish the Concordate's position as the dominant political framework into which the humans would be welcomed, on terms the Concordate found appropriate. 6 ships sent a message that was firm without being aggressive. The humans would be integrated as a developing member state, with graduated rights and obligations appropriate to a civilization new to galactic politics. He met the human fleet at the coordinate Ambassador Chen's team had designated. The human fleet at that coordinate was not 14 ships. The fleet count, when his sensor teams completed their assessment, was 437 vessels, a mix of research vessels, freight carriers, colony ships, and a class of vessel his analysts couldn't classify at all. And among them, 86 warships. Their design was unlike anything in the Concordate's database. The geometric elements echoed predecessor ruins with uncomfortable precision. The hull materials registered as unknown compounds on 3 separate spectrographic analyses. The weapon systems, when Ambassador Chen's team offered a demonstration against uninhabited debris at a safe distance, produced effects that South Kavar's scientists spent the next 3 days attempting to model. They did not fully succeed. He revised his understanding of his directive. Ambassador Chen was throughout this perfectly pleasant. She gave his team full access to non-classified systems on the human vessels. She answered questions thoroughly. She arranged for Dr. Reyes to deliver a presentation on 300 years of human predecessor study that left the Concordate's scientific team in something between professional awe and the specific distress of people who have spent careers on a subject and have just discovered they missed most of it. "We've cataloged 3,700 predecessor sites," Dr. Reyes said. "Approximately 80% of them are in the outer regions, the areas without hyperlane infrastructure." She looked at the Concordate scientists' expressions with careful neutrality. "How many have you found?" 14, Velthren said quietly from the back of the room. The silence that followed had a particular quality. 3,000 years of study, 14 sites. Human scientists had, in 300 years with access to 3,700, done considerably more. The data they shared, selectively, carefully enough to establish credibility, represented a paradigm shift in galactic scientific understanding. The predecessor civilization was not a mystery. It was a puzzle, and humanity had assembled most of it. South Kavar waited until the scientific session was done, and he was meeting alone with Ambassador Chen before asking the question he had been building toward. "Ambassador, why are you here now specifically? If you've been in the outer regions for 300 years, this meeting could have happened long ago." Chen looked at him with the measured openness of someone choosing how much to say. "We came when the timeline became urgent," she said. "What timeline?" "The thing your council classified 3,000 years ago." She watched his face. "We know something happened when the Concordate tried to explore the outer regions. We know because we found the survey records from the expedition that went in and didn't fully come back. We know what they encountered, and we've been watching the same thing for 200 years. She paused. "It's moving. That's why we're here now instead of 50 years from now." South Kavar held her gaze. "What are you talking about?" She said one word. A word in the oldest formal Concordate dialect, a word that was in the records under 7 layers of classification, accessible only to Council Tier 1, a word that should be impossible for her to know, in a form of the language that hadn't been spoken in 2,000 years. She said, "The Viel." The Admiral was silent for a long time. "We found your expedition records," Chen said quietly. "In the outer regions. In a system your people passed through. They left data beacons, probably didn't expect anyone to find them. They described what they saw before they turned back. How long have you known, Ong?" "About 200 years. She looked at him steadily. "Admiral, we didn't come here to tell you the Veil exist. You already know they exist. We came to tell you what we've learned about them in 200 years of watching, and what we think can be done about it. That's why we needed your senior leadership." A pause. "That's also why we brought 437 ships to a diplomatic meeting with 14 as the greeting party. We wanted you to understand, without requiring a demonstration that would have been unfortunate for everyone, that we are not here to negotiate our survival. We are here to offer you assistance with yours." The message he sent to the High Council was the most classified transmission in the Concordate's military history. Then he turned back to Ambassador Chen and said, "Tell me everything." The classification was Tier 1. The emergency session of the High Council convened within 6 hours, the fastest assembly in recorded Concordate history. Ambassador Chen was invited to address them. She had clearly been expecting this. The Veil were not, she explained, a civilization in any conventional sense. The best human analogy was geological. They moved. They had been moving for at least 100,000 years. The predecessor records described them going back that far. Where they moved, Star systems went quiet. Not destroyed exactly. The predecessor records described the process in more complex terms, but silent. Converted to some purpose that nothing native to those systems had agreed to. The Concordate's records from the 3,000-year-old expedition described a brief encounter with something in the outer regions that the expedition had characterized only as vast, slow, and entirely indifferent to them. They had returned, most of them, with strongly worded recommendations that the Concordate's territorial ambitions extend no further than the hyperlane network. The Council at the time had found this recommendation eminently reasonable and had chosen not to share the reasons for it with the member civilizations. The vial's movement patterns, Ambassador Chen said, suggest they process a region and then move on. They spent roughly 3,000 years in the areas adjacent to your outer border. She brought up a display. Vial trajectory over centuries, overlaid on the hyperlane network. Based on 200 years of continuous observation, we believe they've finished with that region. They're moving toward your network. She let the display speak for a moment. Our current best estimate places first contact with a Concordate member world in 35 to 45 years. The council chamber was very quiet. You've lost colonies to them, Councillor Dethron said. 14 colony systems, 40 million people. In the first 50 years after we encountered them, before we understood what we were dealing with. She paused. We haven't lost a colony to them in 150 years. The implication settled into the chamber. How? Speaker Ashavorn said. The predecessors left something behind, Chen said. We found it in the 3rd year of studying their ruins. We didn't understand what it was for another 100 years. We didn't know how to replicate it for another 100 after that. She waited a beat. The predecessor sites aren't ruins. They're infrastructure. Each one is a node in a network that spans the outer regions, areas the veil move through. The network emits a specific signal pattern that the veil find inhospitable. They route around it. They have been routing around it for 100,000 years, which is presumably why the outer regions have anything left in them. The predecessors built a fence. The fence has been running on its own power supply for 100 millennia. Dr. Reyes leaned forward. The power source alone is remarkable engineering. We've spent 30 years analyzing the fence, Councillor Dethron said. You can replicate this signal. We've been doing so for 100 years. It's how our territory has stayed intact. Our ships emit it. Our colony infrastructure emits it. The veil route around our settlements as reliably as they route around the predecessor nodes. Speaker Ashavorn said carefully, you could equip our network with this. Yes, but there's a complication. She brought up the hyperlane network geometry on the display. The fence works because it's comprehensive. The predecessors placed nodes throughout the entire outer region. The veil cannot route around it because there's nowhere to route to within the perimeter. If you deploy the signal on the hyperlane network only, you create a partial fence. A partial fence doesn't exclude the vial, it redirects them. She indicated the inner systems on the display. Redirects them toward the areas of Concordate territory that are hardest to defend, your population centers, your oldest worlds. So we need a complete fence, Soth Kavar said. We need a fence that extends into the outer regions and connects to the existing predecessor network, which requires access to the outer regions, to 3,700 predecessor sites, and to human engineering and technical expertise. She looked around the chamber. Which is what we'd like to discuss. The terms of a genuine partnership, rather than whatever your standard integration protocol requires. The council retired to deliberate. The deliberation was extensive. Ambassador Chen waited in the adjacent reception chamber and thought about Cavendish, the colony system where she had been born, one of the 14 systems that had gone quiet before humanity learned what they were dealing with. She had been 11 years old on a different world when it happened, waiting for her parents to finish their posting. She waited for a long time. Eventually, through the chamber's sound management systems, which were excellent, but not quite as excellent as the sensor suite on a vessel built from predecessor-derived technology, she heard Councillor Dethron say, we should simply take what we need, the technical specifications, the personnel if necessary. We are the Concordate. She had been waiting for something like this. She stood up and walked to the chamber entrance. Councillor Dethron, Ambassador Chen said from the chamber entrance. I'd like to address your proposal. The council chamber waited. You can take our diplomatic personnel. You can probably take our 12 diplomatic vessels if your military assets at this coordinate moved immediately, and we decided not to resist. She spoke with the mild practicality of someone working through a logic problem. You cannot take 300 years of predecessor research, because it exists in distributed archives across 8,000 star systems in the outer regions, where your hyperlane network doesn't go. You cannot take the technical expertise to apply that research, because that expertise exists in approximately 40,000 human scientists and engineers who are also in the outer regions. She looked at Dethron directly. And you cannot take the fence-building capability, which requires not just the technical knowledge but the predecessor sites themselves, their specific geometric configurations, and physical access to a network spanning an area your civilization has never entered. She let that settle. What you can do is the thing I came here to offer. A genuine partnership between two civilizations that each have what the other needs. We need the political recognition and infrastructure access that your established network provides. You need what we've built in the outer regions and what we've learned there. 35 years is not very much time to build a fence that spans a galaxy, and it goes faster with more people working on it. She looked around the chamber. Alternatively, you can attempt to take what you need, at which point you will be managing the geopolitical consequences of that attempt while also having no fence. I leave the calculation to you. She sat down. Soth Kavar's flag bridge received a quiet notification 14 minutes later. The 3 Concordate capital ships that had been maneuvering toward positions useful for seizing the human diplomatic fleet had found, at the positions they were moving toward, that the human delegation fleet had already redistributed itself into a geometry that made the Concordate's approach vectors somewhat academic. No communication had been exchanged. The human ships had simply moved, unhurriedly, into positions that made the intended arrangement impossible without an escalation no one in the room wanted to be responsible for. The council deliberated for another hour. During that hour, every member of the Concordate's 1,200-member representative body received a data transmission from an anonymous source. The transmission contained the full contents of the 3,000-year-old classified expedition records, including the decision made by the council of that era to conceal the vial's existence from the member civilizations on the grounds that widespread knowledge would cause unnecessary panic. Panic being apparently something to be protected against rather than prepared for, regardless of whether the threat had a relevant timeline. The anonymous source was not difficult to identify. There was only one party in the sector operating sensor equipment capable of capturing the council chamber's deliberation audio through its own sound management systems. Ambassador Chen, when later asked whether she had anticipated that she would need to transmit the classified records, said that she had prepared the transmission before leaving human territory. She had hoped not to use it. She had also understood, from 200 years of operating a small political community in the outer regions with 12 other civilizations, that established governing bodies encountering an unfamiliar political dynamic had a statistically predictable response pattern. "We've done this before," she told Soth Kavar, in one of the frank professional conversations that eventually developed between them. "Not with you, with other civilizations in the outer regions. There are 12 of them, by the way. None of them are in the records either. You'll want to know about them. Some will be important for the fence project." 12, he said. 12 civilizations in the outer regions your network missed. Various sizes and development levels. We've been managing a small political community out there for about 200 years. She paused. It's given us some experience with how first contacts go when an established power meets a situation that doesn't fit its standard framework. He was quiet for a moment. "And how do they usually go?" "Better," she said, "when we transmit the records early." The Concordate's council reconstituted itself over 4 days. What replaced Dethron's faction was not chaos. It was a governing body that had absorbed in a very short period of time several large pieces of information it had not possessed before, and had made the institutional decision, rapidly, under the specific pressure of an existential timeline, to be more useful than it had been. Speaker Ashavorn's first communication to Ambassador Chen was direct. "We accept your terms, full partnership, equal standing. We are ready to begin." The joint project that came to be called the Perimeter Initiative began with a preliminary planning session 8 days after humanity's first appearance at Threshold Station 9 sensor range. The scope was significant. A network of signal emitters and predecessor site activations spanning a region of space the Concordat had never entered, using technology the Concordat had not possessed, built by a workforce that included human engineers, the 12 previously unrecorded outer region civilizations, and an increasing number of Concordat scientists who had realized, in the first week of partnership, that their careers had just become considerably more interesting. Felthren spent the first month updating the records. 14 predecessor sites became 3,700. The outer region civilizations required individual entries. Vast sections of the galaxy's map labeled unmapped, no strategic interest, required replacement with actual survey data. It was less like updating the records and more like discovering that the records had been describing a small, well-lit room in a much larger and stranger building. She found it alternately humbling and exhilarating. Primarily exhilarating, which was not what she had expected. Fleet Admiral Osi and High Admiral Sothkavar developed over the course of the initiative's first year, the kind of professional relationship that forms between people who recognize in each other the specific quality of commanders who have spent their careers dealing with problems rather than performing authority. The human fleet's redistribution during the Council's deliberation came up eventually. "How did you know what we were planning?" Sothkavar asked. "We read the positioning," Ose said, "and we've done this before." "You keep saying that. It keeps being relevant." The final revelation came 6 months after initial contact. Dr. Reyes had requested a meeting with the full council, not the diplomatic team, not the scientific committee, but the full 1,200-member civilization representatives. The request was unusual enough that Ashavorn granted it. The presentation was about the predecessor message. Every predecessor site had a communication node embedded in its architecture, a feature human researchers had identified in the first decade of their study and had spent 270 years decoding, because the encoding system was not designed for any of the current galactic species' cognitive architectures. It was designed for whoever came after the predecessors, for whoever was patient and capable enough to spend the necessary time in the outer regions, where the majority of the nodes existed, where the work had to be done in the dark between the hyperlanes. Humanity had spent the necessary time. The message was not one message. It was a library, the predecessors' complete record of their civilization, compressed and preserved across the nodes, transmitted to the decoder via a process that had taken 30 years to develop a receiving system for. The library's preface, in the first thing decoded, the first thing deliberately transmitted, was a single statement in a mathematical language that required no translation. "Good, you found us. We knew someone would. We left this for you." The predecessors had not died. They had not been destroyed. They had not fled in any direction that implied defeat or fear. They had made a decision, documented in the library with the care of a civilization that kept excellent records, to move beyond the galaxy, into whatever was further, in the belief that the galaxy would eventually produce someone capable of managing its own affairs. They had left the fence. They had left the library. They had positioned 3,700 sites specifically so that any civilization capable of reaching them would have what they needed to understand what came before and prepare for what came next. They had been patient. 100,000 years. Ambassador Chen stood at the back of the council chamber while Dr. Reyes concluded the presentation, watching 1,200 representatives absorb what it meant that the greatest mystery in galactic history had been resolved, and resolved with an answer that was not an ending but an invitation. She thought about Cavendish, about 40 million people and 14 colony systems in the 150 years that came after, building something in the dark that could protect what remained. She thought about the fence that had held since then, and the library they had spent 3 centuries decoding, and the decision to come here now, at this specific moment, when the timeline required it, because the only way to build something big enough was to do it together. Fleet Admiral Osi appeared at her shoulder. 12 more civilizations in the outer regions, he said quietly. A fence that runs across a galaxy, 3,700 pieces of a library, and 14 ships was enough to start all of it. She looked at him. We've never needed many ships to cause a significant problem for someone who wasn't paying attention. The records, for the first time in 3,000 years, required a new section, Not an update. Not a correction to existing data. A new section, a category that had not existed before, for territories and civilizations and knowledge that had been present in the galaxy all along, and simply had not been catalogued because no one with a catalog had gone there. They called it simply the Outer. Humanity had already been living there for 400 years. The predecessors had been building there for 100,000. And whatever came next, the fence, the library, the slow work of a galaxy learning to know itself, would be built there too. Not in the well-lit corridors of established hyperlane networks, but in the unmapped dark, where the records had always been incomplete, and the most important things had always been written in the spaces between the lines. The records had missed humanity not because their systems had failed. They had missed humanity because humanity had gone somewhere the systems didn't reach. And out there, in the part of the galaxy that wasn't in anyone's records, they had found something worth coming back to share.